Good morning, everybody. Here we are again in Roy Branson Sabbath School, Legacy Sabbath School, and we have a very interesting subject and a great group of people to talk about it. But to begin with, I'm going to Dorothy, who is going to lead us in text reading and prayer.
Okay, let's have prayer first. Thank you for our virtual class and the members here today. Please help us comfort and aid those around us who are having any sort of weighing issues and unhappiness. May we as Christians be loving and in our daily life and to others around us and our family. Amen.
Amen.
I have 3 verses I'm to read, or is it 4? You check. The first one is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. There are many different versions, and I go back to the one I memorized as a child. Then we have Matthew 28:18-20, and I'm reading the King James Version. And Jesus came and spoke unto them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen. Then I have Revelation 14:6-7, and this is the New International Version. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. And then I have 1 John 4:19-21, New International Version. We love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given us his commandment. Anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. And I think David is going to take over now, and we will start. Is that correct, David?
Yes, thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Simona. Thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce 3 people who are at the peak of their careers right now. This is a time when they are most influential and successful, and we are honored to have them with us. They are all colleagues of mine, friends of mine, so this is kind of a homecoming for me as well. And I was hoping we could get one of them to discuss their book, but Mark Carr was able to get himself and 2 others. So we have 3 authors in this book. It's just really splendid. So the book is called A House on Fire, How Adventist Faith Responds to Race and Racism. It was published last year by Signs Publishing Company in Australia, Warburton, which is not far from Melbourne. And it has essays from a wide variety of people taking many diverse points of view on this issue. So I'm going to start with Maury, because he's the editor, along with Nathan Brown, and we will ask him first about the book in general, and then about his own chapter, and we'll go then to Mark and to Andy about their chapters. But first of all, Maury, why did you edit this book at this time?
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you for the rest of you in this wonderful legacy class to host us and to make this book a part of your conversation and discussion. what happened was while we were under lockdown during COVID, and I was teaching online here from my home, students at La Sierra University, I received an email from Nathan Brown asking if we could have a Zoom meeting. We did, and this was after the homicide of George Floyd. And Nathan then asked me if he could get a hold of my doctoral project and read it, which was on how Adventist journals, official Adventist journals, address contemporary moral issues after 9/11. And so I told him, yeah, sure thing. But then I had no expectation he was going to read it. He did. And then he came back to me and said, look, I'd like for you and I to co-edit a book that is an Adventist anti-racism kind of work. And so then we just agreed we would do it. And I said, well, I said, I know a lot of people I'd like to have contribute, but I have a couple of things I want. Number one, no one from the international denominational seminaries. I said, I want to introduce people in our communion to union level tertiary institution scholars, religious scholars. I want them to understand that we are now getting big enough where we can focus our attention more regionally. The second thing is I didn't want it to be a kind of framed in an American black-white discussion. So I said, I want us to have contributors from every habitable continent and the islands of the sea, or are descended from those continents. And so he agreed. And then I told him, I have two names to start with, Andy Lampkin and Mark Carr. And so we began collecting contributions. And what we asked of them was essentially something like this: draw from Adventist, either Adventist doctrines, either Adventist heritage, or Adventist text of scriptures that are important to us, or our own theological reflections that you think contribute to the work of anti-racism. And once we collected those contributions, we started to make edits. Nathan mentioned, but it was already in my mind, that we also wanted as many women as men. And so we tried for that in our initial gathering, but then toward the end, we saw some gaps, and we wanted then to reach out to some people we thought could fill those gaps quickly as we were getting to the close of the project.
How has it been received so far?
I think so far it's been received well. It's been received as a welcoming voice to many, for others as an opportunity to grow their vocabulary and their skills to discuss issues of racism. And I think on Amazon, we got one real bad, we only got two what do you call them, written kind of reviews, but one who really thought it was not good. But I expect that you'll get that anywhere. Yeah.
Of course. Now, do you think of your target audience Adventists or people of other faiths or no faiths or both? It sounds like you were drawing on distinctively Adventist resources to deal with this issue of racism. Is that correct?
Yes, but we were trying to draw on it to engage. So we wanted to basically take a snapshot of how Adventist religious scholars both draw from their own resources as they are in conversation with other resources on this topic, so that we can not only learn how to follow the discourse, but also how to engage with it, join it, and even shepherd it.
Okay. All right. One last question before your chapter, and that is, what is the house you're referring to? You know, can I say something just about my mother real quickly?
Please, please.
When I was in the senior year of high school, My mother walked into my bedroom, threw a book on my bed. She said, "You better read this." It was James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. It was wonderful. What a way to have it. I thought everybody's mother did that, right? After I got along. That wasn't so. It was wonderful. It scared me.
Okay.
It scared me. But powerful, right? Okay. Yeah. What is The House on Fire? When I saw your title, I immediately thought of James Baldwin's book.
Well, there was a working movement that we had, and one was to put contributions into different sections. And so the different sections were really smaller. So one was going to be finding Bethel, reaching to the house of God. Another was playing the race card, a house of cards, playing the race card. We were running all these kinds of movements, but when Janet Dwight gave us her chapter, we realized we'll scrap the section subheads, we'll take the house on fire, and realize that we're really talking about the global house, because I am an ecumenically oriented Adventist Christian. So I like to speak about Adventist Christianity as a communion of Christians within the one church. And so my ecumenism is always interested in how do we as a communion of Christians speak to the whole household of faith and the whole household of this world that God has. And that's really how we wanted to kind of orient.
Oh my, I didn't realize it. So really, Janice's chapter, which I think is number 1, that's where the title came from that chapter.
Yes, I think we may have had that as one of the subsection titles, but we saw her work and said, really, this is a way to structure it. And we tried to structure it this way, if I could just say one more thing. We wanted to go from the most accessible to the least accessible, from the most familiar to the least familiar, the most concrete to the more abstract. And so the further down you read, it can become intellectually demanding, particularly when you get to Hans Gutierrez's chapter. So
isn't that always the case when we get to Hans Gutierrez?
A little aside from me as well. He's written this beautiful manuscript on hermeneutics, 350 pages long. He wrote it in Italian, translated it into English himself. Great book, bad English. Guess who's working through every single sentence on that manuscript? I'm having...
Great for you, man.
Gary Chartier says an academic press will publish it. It is, here's the thesis. Western modernity and Christian hermeneutics in the West are opposite sides of the same counterfeit coin.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah,
it's
going to be a great book. Yeah. Well, how about your chapter, Maury?
So my chapter, let me ask, I don't want to break protocol. Do you do any screen share?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, maybe this might keep me on task with time. So I'm going to just introduce you to it via a PowerPoint, if that's okay with you all.
Yes.
Wait, I made a mistake. I should have opened this up, slideshow. Can I get it without that? All right. So my chapter was entitled Erasing Sin. All right. Adventist Christianity's Catholic Vocation. I just want to, this is not explicitly in the chapter, but it motivated the chapter. It's implied, right? The problem of defining racism. So and I'm drawing a little from Sally Haslinger's book, Resisting Reality, Social Construction and Social Critique. Questions of what the term race means and whether race is real have become tied up with different political goals and strategies for achieving them. And Haslinger lays this out. So she has 3 kind of visions. Race eliminativism is we need to eliminate all race talk because we know whether by genotype, phenotype, or complexion, we cannot measure one race from another. So justice would say, stop talking about it, and because the discussion of it participates in advancing racism. So that's one way, the race eliminativist. The other is the race constructionist. Now, the race constructionist says race is actually real, but it is the reality of social construction. I kind of tell students in class, football is real, but its reality is seen in linemen, in coaches, in quarterbacks, in running backs, wide receivers, big stadiums, owners. Even though it's real, it's only real as a social reality, a social construction. It has a dependent ontology on the social group. So those who are race social constructionists say race is a social construction, it's a real one, and justice requires that we recognize the mechanism of racial formation and undo the damage. So that's different from race eliminativism. The last is, like the social constructionist, says race is real, but it's a natural reality. So this is the other side of the race eliminativist, if this were a spectrum, and says race is natural. I like to remind people, as a mid-50s African-American male, if I go see my physician and they don't take into consideration the kind of health issues that emerge among Black men with respect to prostate cancer, etc., they would not be acting with justice toward my own care. So justice requires that we address racially divergent medical needs. So these are three different approaches, okay? And it's important to know that the facts won't settle the issue, because the question is, what are the relevant facts here? And that's why this kind of conversation, I think, is important. So I wanted to deal with the motivation behind it. And then so I have a working definition of race. I didn't make this explicit, probably should have, but Nathan keeps reminding me, Maury, we have to put covers on a book. And at some point we have to stop writing. But race, I say, is an error theory with respect to ordinary judgments about human difference. It implicitly claims to be designating some objective description of human nature. However, these claims are all false. So it's an error theory. Racism is a human mechanism that functions to operationalize the concept of race as a tool of social management that separates, stratifies, and sanctifies social hierarchies. So these are some of those definitions that I'm working with. Just to let you know, by the way, in this book, there are over 160 citations from the Bible. And I think that's important to note. We draw from the Bible. So my chapter in particular was trying to note that there's a trouble with defining sin. Explain actions. I've learned this. Mark is chiding me with a text message. I'm gonna leave it alone, Mark. We'll talk about that later. So look, it's easier for us to explain actions or to interpret meanings. I can explain an action and say that was prejudice, that was bigoted. I can interpret meanings that had some significance or some meaning, but it's harder to analyze concepts. And so what my chapter is trying to do is not so much explain actions or interpret meanings, but to analyze the concepts of sin and the concepts of race and racism. So we know some familiar biblical passages on the phenomena of sin. 1 John 3:4, sin is the transgression of the law. You have a law and you transgress it, you've sinned. James 4:17, to not do what you know is good is sin. So this is an important point because it moves outside of a textual legal context into an internal rule that that governs you, and to violate that rule is to sin. Then Romans 14, that which doesn't ensue from faith. So anything that acts out of in faithlessness, there's another way of defining sin. How about this? Hebrews 11:25. There is pleasure in sin, but it's seasonal. It's not enduring pleasure. And to engage in this seasonal, non-enduring pleasure of sin is to have kind of misplaced your trust or have some false aims. Okay, so the phenomena of sin, a theoretical framework. Sin denotes, I would say, a generic designation that organizes a group of concepts, all of which indicate a broad range of pervasive evil. So sin and racism are both dynamic and they both mutate. I kind of am working on a theory that racism is the sin of its parent sin that mimics its parent sin, namely it mutates like sin does, and it manifests at different times in different ways, and we kind of have to be vigilant and address it. I draw off the work of practical theologian Don Browning, and here's how he describes it. He says, sin is not an empirical reality in the form of discrete sense data. This has been from the days of Descartes, the model of the empirical in the natural sciences. Rather, sin is empirical in the sense of a broad pattern of experience that must be given symbolic form if we are to grasp adequately its pervasive presence. The question is not whether there is sin, but the shape that it takes. And again, if this is a book on how Adventists respond to race and racism, think of that last sentence and let's just substitute racism. The question is not whether there is racism, but the shape that it takes, right? Racism parents, it parrots its parent sin. And then Don Browning makes this point. Sin affects the totality of human potentialities, spirit, passion, emotion, reason, and intellect. All of these are subject to inordinate self-concern. Sin affects all human efforts to erect rational and disinterested systems of morality and government. And then he uses this phrase, all people are equally sinful, but they are not equally guilty. All people are equally sinful, but they are not equally guilty. So distinguishing the concept of sin from the concept of guilt keeps us from falling into the trap of defining humanity solely with criteria drawn from biological classifications. It also keeps us from the trap of cynicism. If we all have sinned, well, what the heck? There's a quote from the movie, the Netflix series Outlander, where one of the characters who's suffering is about to take a poison to end his life. And someone says, you shouldn't do that because that's a sin. And he says, well, what's one more sin to a sinner? Right. And so, this is important to distinguish those concepts. Dietrich Bonhoeffer then helps us, and I try to move us to Dietrich Bonhoeffer because he helps us think about not only what sin is, but how to resolve it. So he says, when the human race is understood by means of the biological concept of the species, the ethical gravity of the concept of culpability is weakened. We must thus discover a Christian ethical concept of the species. The issue is how to understand the human species in terms of the concept of sin. So in his Sanctorum Communio, Bonhoeffer is doing really recognizing that the church is the new humanity, and as the new humanity, God is doing something unique to reconstitute our social realities that are broken by sin and isolated. Again, Bonhoeffer, the human being by virtue of being an individual is also the human race. Thus, all humanity falls with each sin, and not one of us is in principle different from Adam. That is, everyone is also the first sinner. So for Bonhoeffer, we have to think about anytime I do something bad that is a sin, I am complicit in breaking everyone else, making the whole unit fall. And in that sense, I am the first sinner. I am the Adam. I am the one who's culpable in the fall of everyone else. And so, again, I brought that I already talked about that quote, but from Column, what is one more sin to a sinner? And now let's ask, what is one more discriminatory act to a racism-saturated society? See, if we move into that kind of cynicism, it becomes, hey, you can't do anything about this, let's just move on. And I'm drawn from Walter Rauschenbusch's work in Christianity and the Social Crisis, where he says, look, all of us believe that sanctification is a work that perfects us, but we'll never be perfect in this life. But none of us say, well, since you'll never be perfect in this life, give up on it, just enjoy it. And he says, if we can do that on the individual, we need to also think about, even though in this life we will never reach fully the kingdom of God, we should be socializing in such a way that we're moving toward it, right? And all right, so there is no better place to highlight where sin amplifies racism and how racism amplifies sin than by analyzing the fragile psyches of those who benefit from the structural inequities their society advantages them over racially subjugated people. And I'm speaking about this because I had as a main interlocutor in my chapter, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. And I was trying to, what do I want to say, rehabilitate her from some of her critical scholars. So what does Robin DiAngelo do? She goes, when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. Racism for her is a structure, not an event. Now, McWhorter is an African-American scholar from Columbia University, and he really critiques DiAngelo's book. He's in one brief article on a book review about racism, he uses words like sinner, prayer book, cult, proselytizer, catechism, original sin, dogma, and misguided pastor. And I say McWhorter may be onto something with the language he uses, but he might have missed something greatly about dismissing the connection between racism and sin. He wants to say, oh, Robin DiAngelo is an evangelist, and you got to dismiss her. This is really religious work. But I come out of a John Milbank notion that theology and social theory, theology itself is a kind of social science, and we ought to respect it as a way of analyzing and critiquing some of the phenomena we see in our world. This is now coming to the end. On being Catholic Adventist. Adventist Christianity has a Catholic vocation. And I make this point that denominationalism is the religious species of ethnocentric and racist practices. The church's antidote for such practices is a Catholic vision of the people of God and ecumenical engagement. The Adventist Catholic vocation is to participate in God's work of erasing sin from the universe. And I point out that early Adventists come from various denominations, and therefore there was this already ecumenism, a part of our early formation. And then when I was a kid, I remember growing up in a small church in Little Rock, California, where we would gather. And during the growth, I remember during our emerging, we'd read Nahum 1:9 and misquote it. And Nahum 1:9, our elders would say, sin will not rise a second time. Don't worry. When the eschaton comes, we won't have to worry about sin rising again. During the growth of the racist transatlantic slave trade, an ecumenical movement of Christians sought its Catholicity in the hope of Christ's return. The earliest Adventist Christians chose actions that bridged community rather than bind it to the sin of racism, denominationalism, and separatism. All right, there I am. That's it. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you very much. Maury is the Associate Dean at the HMS Richards Divinity School at La Sierra. He's been a pastor for 15 years, has degrees in ministry and also in philosophy. So he works both sides of that street, pastoral care and philosophy both. So thank you, Maury. Over now to Mark Carr, who is the Senior Director of Ethics at Providence Health. And I think he's located in Anchorage. Is that right, Mark?
I certainly am located in Anchorage.
All right. So he too has been a pastor for a number of years. He has degrees from looks like Walla Walla and maybe Andrews, I'm not sure. Do you?
Yeah.
And then
Andrews
also
Seminary.
from the University of Virginia. And on his approach, we plunge deeply into the world of narrative ethics. So over to you, Mark.
Sure, thanks. And I just want to also note that some of the symbiotic kind of conversations going on with my colleagues at work. I am part of a 10-member theology and ethics team for the Providence healthcare system. It's a 52 hospital system. And we on that team, not a particularly diverse team, I would say, but we committed ourselves to attending or trying to learn more about the effects of race and racism, particularly in Catholic healthcare, of course. But some of our conversations have included Dr. Yolanda Wilson, who now works at a Jesuit university, St. Louis University. And just this week, we had a conversation about meaning well. And what sort of credit do white people get for meaning well when we walk into difficult conversations about race and racism? And for instance, just because it's fun and we have some bioethicists on the call, I asked the question, should Beecham and Childress get credit for meaning well in their multiple editions of Principles of Biomedical Ethics? And she was having none of it. Nope.
Really?
No
Whoa.
credit. Yeah. She said, now I understand we have to do obeisance to Beecham and Childress. I mean, she's not ignorant to that fact, but she said, for instance, their common morality, the use that Beecham and Childress use of common morality, in her view, and I can't help but agree with her here, it's absurd to imagine that the common morality that they use as somewhat of a foundation for their approach does not appropriately account for American racism. And it strikes me she has a pretty good point. Well, all of that aside,
Just for a moment, so everybody's part of this conversation.
sorry.
Beecham and Childress. Childress was Mark Carr's teacher. They have published a book called Principles of Bioethics, which I think is the first testament of bioethics. I would say Mark Siegler's book on clinical ethics would be the second testament. If one has those two books, one's well on the way. But as the title suggests, it emphasizes principles which are grounded in the common morality. And that's quite different from narrative ethics, as Mark is going to share with us now.
Yes. So I have wanted to assert for many, many years, as much as I can publicly and in print, that stories are far more powerful in our life of faith than are propositional truths or lists of fundamental beliefs. The stories that we tell are significantly more influential in our life. And the church ought to pay a lot more attention to the stories within us, within our faith tradition than they do. And I would furthermore assert that we have an amazing trove of stories in our short history that could be mined in ways that we have not even fully learned to imagine. And I think we don't serve ourselves well. Now, the title of my essay is Redemptive Storytelling in a Post-Truth Adventism. Maury noted that in one of his slides that the facts won't settle this issue. We live in a post-truth alternative fact society. 2016 Oxford Word of the Year, hyphenated, post-truth. Not long after that, literally months after that, Kellyanne Conway referred on national television to alternative facts associated with how many people came to the inauguration of President Trump. So how do we attend to stories in our faith tradition if all we're going to do is argue about what is the story? And so when I set out to talk about, at Maury's invitation, when I set out to talk about narrative ethics as it specifically refers and attends to the issue of American racism, I just felt compelled, number one, to find the story. Now, I'm kind of old school fundamentalist in many ways, but a mixture of idealism and pragmatism that makes no sense to anybody else, not much sense to me. But I set out to find the story for American Seventh-day Adventism about race. And it turns out there is no the story. There are multiple stories, and there are debates about the same story within multiple Adventist communities. For instance, when I talk to my white Adventist colleagues, the story about racism in America, there may be two or three. The fact that we were involved in some measure in the abolitionist movement has served along these lines. But the primary story that we tell ourselves is the story about the Morning Star. You may recall the boat that the General Conference built with donated funds, and the boat was captained by our prophetess's own son, who mounted the boat and sailed south into the dark counties of the American South to save the colored people. And we revel in that story. And whenever anyone asks a question to a white person, at least, about how does Adventism engage itself with race and racism in America? That's one of the favorite go-to stories. The other story that I found in my research that I wasn't even aware of is about Lucy Bayard. Lucy Bayard was a church member of ours, African-American woman, and her husband came to the Washington, D.C. area at the invitation of the General Conference. Someone in the General Conference urged them to come to our hospital in Baltimore. And she had an illness. I think it had something to do with her kidneys. I didn't pay much attention to what the illness was, but when she showed up, our admitting person at the hospital said, "Oh dear, well, you didn't tell us you were Black." And the stories diverge here depending upon who's telling the story. When white people tell the story, it almost always says something along the lines of, yes, we did indeed discover then that they were a Black couple, and we offered them a room, but they rejected it. Now, the room that they offered was in the basement, in the janitorial offices, or in that area where they told her they would bring her food in sufficient quantity and care for her in the basement. Others tell the story differently, and the long and short of it is Lucy Bayard and her husband went to the historically Black hospital and were cared for there by a Black Adventist physician. In in that hospital where she died some 40 some days later. I think this was in the 40s. I'm never very good at remembering the dates, but I'm pretty sure it was in the 40s. And part of the reality of this story and the mixture of Adventist history and historians look at ourselves becomes very interesting. So immediately after this time, within 6 months, there was a special meeting called by the General Conference, a spring council, where the question of whether or not to establish regional conferences was on the agenda. Now, the only reason that there was this special meeting or this special agenda for the Spring Council was because a group that started after the Lucy Bayard event, a group of laypersons that prompted these meetings. And the long and short of that story is that the regional conferences were created at that Spring Council. And one of the things that is associated with the point of what I wanted to say here is what we do with the stories and what kind of people it creates. So when I came into the church and began to learn about Adventism and race, I heard about regional conferences. And what I heard about regional conferences was that Blacks in the country really wanted to lead their own groups. They didn't want to have to be, mixed in with the regular conferences, because that way they would be less likely to be in positions of leadership, and they wanted to be in positions of leadership. So we created regional conferences for them and their community. That was kind of the story that I remember hearing. Well, as I looked into the history of these events, when the color line was held firm, the special meeting that I referred to is the central decision for the onset of the regional conferences. And I don't know how one can authentically or intellectually or honestly argue that the regional conferences were created at their request. When I say their, I mean the Black Adventist community. They were requesting full integration at that Spring Council meeting. And the only people voting were whites in control of the General Conference at the time. And they voted very clearly to maintain the color line, to stay segregated, and to create regional conferences. So that's part of the downstream story and effect of the Lucy Bayard story. Now, two quick things, and then I'll be quiet. Narrative theology and ethics is supremely messy in relation to propositional lists of fundamental beliefs. And just the thoughts that have come to your mind as I've told these stories or related these stories to you, I can assure you, your mind has already begun to question whose story is the accurate one, because that's what we do. Those who dig into narrative theology and ethics, primarily Stanley Hauerwas and colleagues who have published on these topics, have argued that the type of people that a story produces is one of the most important things that we can use to evaluate narrative theology, narrative ethics, the stories that motivate and define us. What kind of people does the story create? Are they peaceable? Are they seeking community with others, and so on? So they have a list of criteria, if you will, on how stories may be at least loosely analyzed as expressed through the people that the stories generate. And to that end, then, one can see the downstream effect of the stories within Adventism. And the final thesis that or idea that I put out in my paper is that Black American Adventism has redeemed or maintained or rescued or allowed American Adventism to be viable because they stayed with Adventism. It's a thesis that James Cone brings in his book on the cross, and argues that Black Christianity in America has redeemed Christianity in America. I would argue the same thing. And here's a specific event, and then I'll be quiet. At I think it was the 100-year anniversary in the Mid-America Union, there was a special event to highlight, and I note this in my chapter. And the Union president, whose name always escapes me, he and his officers at this special event came to the podium, and he offered a reflection on the anniversary of the regional conferences. And at the end of that reflection on the anniversary of the regional conferences, he and his officers went to the microphone and apologized to those present, many of whom were, of course, personnel from regional conferences, that this situation had come to pass. And he said, among other things, it doesn't take more than a nanosecond to realize that the regional conferences exist because whites were unable to imagine a fully integrated church. Now, if you're the regional conference union president person, again, I don't know the name, and I don't know the name of the position. I'm terrible at those sorts of things. At any rate, what would you say if you just had this door opened to you and you came to the microphone to respond to the apology that was just offered you about an event that happened 100 years ago? What would you say? And part of my assertion is that the grace and decency with which that man responded is illustrative of the way stories shape us. And the story as it has lived out in the African-American community has shaped them into better people than the story of those whites who have clung desperately to the idea that we're not racist. It lived itself out in that event in particular. And again, there are lots of other illustrations like that, stories that have little or nothing to do with our fundamental beliefs, but have much to do with our community of faith. Thank you, David. You're muted still.
I did not realize, Mark, the connection temporally and logically between the Bayard case and the emergence of the regional conferences. That was particularly interesting to me.
Well, along those lines, I read more Adventist history for the preparation of this article than I'm used to. And I tell you what, we are not utilizing our church historians very effectively. We need to use them and believe their work.
Yeah. I see. That's helpful. Let's take a break now so that we're not rushed when we hear Andy. It is now about 10:22. Let's try to be back at 10:32, and we'll get going at that time. All right, everybody, up and get a beverage that will wake you up, and then we'll get together at 10:32. Thank you.
First, let me say I'm absolutely honored to be a part of the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School with my colleague and friend, Dave Larson. Don't say it enough, but Dave means a whole lot to me. And I'm always honored to be online with Mark Carr and Maury Jackson. They've been my conversation partners about these kinds of issues, as well as many other issues, but serious discourse about race now for a few decades. And so I'll do a bit of what Dr. Jackson did, what Maury did, and a slide presentation. I'll move through it quickly just to kind of get the issues on the table. Hopefully we have some time, and I think Dr. Larson, you leave some time for a discussion. So I'll move relatively quickly, but just to keep me on pace, I'll share my screen.
Yeah, don't hurry. We want to get the full benefit of your comments.
Okay, I'm encouraged. I'm always mindful of the time. Okay. I hope you're seeing my screen. So the title of, you see my screen, thumbs up. The title of my chapter in the book was Spitting in the Face of God While Waiting on Christ's Return. So you get an immediate glimpse that we're playing on this whole idea of Adventist believers waiting on Christ's soon return. Okay, I begin with a Baldwin quote. I don't need to read it now, but Dr. Larson, when you talked about James Baldwin worked the fire next time, I thought about it. And I think there are several authors in this edited volume that actually pick up on Baldwin. And he deals with, in this quote, from his perspective, just, you know, how racism is just built into the fundamental structures of society. Hey, I'm here now. Every white person in this country, and I do not care what he says or what she says, knows one thing. They may not know, as they put it, what I want. That was often a question during the civil rights era and prior to that time. Well, what do you want? But they know that they would not like to be Black here. And he's talking here in America. If they know that, Baldwin says, they know everything they need to know. If you know that much, you wouldn't want to be Black in America, then you know enough. Whatever else they say is a lie. And of course, you can imagine during that period of our history, and again, this is in the 60s and then years after, there was a lot of discussion in this country. Does racism exist? I remember my early college years. Does racism still exist? You know, people thought there was slavery in this country. We fought a civil war over it. There was a civil rights movement, and it was all over. You know, it was all over. And tongue in cheek, sometimes I raise the question, well, where did all the racists go? You know, where did they go? Some went to law school, some went to medical school, and I even say some may have gone to divinity school or other schools of higher education that dealt with religion. But this is what was going on in society. Definitely in Baldwin's time, I mean, it was a racially segregated society, and that's what he's reflecting on. Then in my chapter, I talk about an experience I had as a child. And those who are on this line who know me and know me well know I seldom actually talk about myself. I talk about ideas, but I seldom personalize things and go and share with my experience. But I tell this story of my childhood. I was a teen. I can't recall if I was 13 or 14. I grew up 20 miles west of the city of Chicago. And for those of you who are familiar with the Chicagoland area, and again, was born right at the end of the civil rights movement, so I came to age in the 70s and the like. Chicago at that time, and it's still like that to this day, was a very, very racially and ethnically segregated city. It's like that to this day. But if you could imagine in the 70s and early 70s at that, I don't even think we were in the 80s yet when this experience happened to me. I think I was late 70s, very segregated communities. And so we left our community, my friend and I. Again, we're teenagers. We're pedaling our bikes. We're riding our bikes into another suburban town. And again, this is suburban Chicago. As the saying go, we were up south. You know, you heard the expression down south, and everybody talks about how bad it was down south, but we were up south. You know, we were up in the Chicago land area. I rode my bike. We actually were going to a bike shop to check out the new bike we wanted. That's basically what we were doing. Long story short, on our way home, we were basically accosted by, I can't recall, it was 4 or 5 young men in a car, hanging out their car, calling us everything but children of God. You know how they go. And of course, they're throwing around the N-word. And then my friend caught a big glob, and sorry about the grotesque language, a big glob of spit. Somebody spat at us, and it landed on him. I remember that story just like it happened yesterday, and we're talking 40 plus years ago. It remains in my mind. And it's interesting enough, Maury, I don't think you mind me mentioning it. You shared a similar story after I shared my story, and then Mark was at the conference with us just I guess that was a week ago, and another African American in our same age group spoke up. I have been spat upon myself. And it's just shocking that once we start talking about these stories, these things come to mind. And I make the point in telling that story in my chapter, the way kind of racism function. Here it is. Racism is a kind of evil that impacts children, youth, and adults alike. Age does not matter. Your economic status does not matter. Your education or attainment does not matter. Your religion or your deep and abiding love for America doesn't matter. I share with these, at least Mark and Maury. I grew up in a family, again, 20 miles west of the city, and Pops flew the flag, the United States flag, on the 4th of July. We had barbecue, deeply committed to this country. That does not matter. What we learned that day is that race matters. Clearly, perhaps I've had other experience with racism prior to that, but it was something about that experience, that very painful experience, that I remember it to this day. So I talk a bit about that experience. And then I move just very briefly to a discourse about racism. And this just has been my experience over the years. Conversations about racism are always difficult. We could just start there. These kind of conversations are always difficult. And there's some, we can explore maybe in the discussion, we can explore why conversations are never dispassionate or objective. And for a lot of reasons, those of us who've experienced blatant forms of racism, I mean, we're sensitive about these things. And then I think sometimes on the other side of the discussion, the worst thing you can be in American society in many ways is to be called, it's not the worst, but a racist who wants to be called a racist. And so nobody really wants to talk about it. These discussions are difficult. And then when we have them, they're seldom dispassionate or objective. And this third point, there's never time. So Dr. Larson, I appreciate you saying, hey, take your time, because I was just about to rush through it. Say, take your time and let's talk about it. I really appreciate that, because oftentimes we stay on such a surface that we never move the discussion to a depth that we can actually get somewhere together, and the discussion is actually transformative. Hence, participants are very seldom, very often left unsatisfied with the discussion. So the goals of my chapter is actually quite modest: to offer an understanding of racism. Maury did this in his chapter, to explore the idea of racism as an American racial caste system. That idea, America as a racial caste system, is not new to me. I'm not completely and absolutely convinced by it, but I kind of offer it. I'm attempting to explain, well, let me put it this way. At some point, you have to explain health disparities, inequities that we find in the healthcare system. At some point, you got to try to explain the fact that Blacks and brown people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and the like. And how do you account for that? These things just didn't happen. They, in many ways, are the disparities, again, and the criminalization of African Americans. These things go back to, in many ways, Reconstruction, you know, and so it's like you just got to make sense of those. And then the third thing I attempt to do is explore Adventist teachings that should inform our attitudes. And this section is relatively thin. In many ways, it captures some of the texts, the passages of scripture that were read at the very beginning, that God loves us all and that we should basically love and care and be concerned for one another as a religious mandate. I note these three goals, and I guess it's just kind of a broader overarching goal. I wrote this chapter in many ways so we can have some conversation around the idea of race in the church. I think that's the task and purpose of the book in many ways. But so we can kind of organize our thoughts around some kind of consistent understandings or similar understandings, because we often, again, talk over each other. So I'm hoping, and I think it has happened, that the book in my chapter would create conversation, and that we can have conversation partners around these very, very complex issues. Racism, two typical views. And again, I was working towards simplicity here. Racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race. I think that's kind of a typical view of racism and how oftentimes people think about racism. And then there's a second definition that embraces the first. And then Jackson got at this in his description of racism. It's when these views are, when prejudice is reinforced with systems of power. And I often say, the first is a view. Racism is prejudice against someone because of their race, and that matters. But many of us, what we are most concerned with is when race and the prejudice that comes with it is tied to and is reinforced by systems of power. That matters to us. We're concerned with that a little bit more. I wish everybody would like me. I wish everybody would love me, but we know that's not going to happen. So I'm not that sentimental. But when I go to the mall, right, I don't want to be followed around by, the person trying to sell their wares because they're so afraid that I may take something. When I'm driving, my car down the street and there's a small traffic infraction, and we all have these small traffic infractions. If and when I'm pulled over by the police, I want to be able to go home at the end of the day. So it's those kinds of things. So when you tie racial prejudice to power, when I apply for a promotion at work, I don't want my race to get in the way. It's those kinds of things. So it's race prejudice tied to power that I'm more concerned with it. And I think that many of the authors in the book were more concerned with. One of the limitations of the first view is that when we focus on the first view, we focus on offensive words and behaviors. I like this statement here: we inaccurately reduce issues of race in America to a battle for the hearts and minds of the individual races, instead of seeing racist and racist behavior and racial oppression part of a larger system. So we kind of miss the point. And there's some interesting things going on. I often cite what we very often do during the month of February. And I think it's a good thing during Black History Month. We show those videos, and some of you will remember Eyes on the Prize. And we have Maury throw his head down. It's absolutely eyes on the prize. And the message we send people in society, and we talk people in society, people who are not like ourselves, picking up books, reading about this stuff, just getting glimpses of it here and there. We think about the Klan marching through town on the horse, right? We think about the 50s and the 60s and Little Rock and Birmingham, those voices on the sidewalk screaming, "Go back to Africa and go home, Negro," and all those kinds of things. That's what we think about when we think about races. And again, that's getting at that kind of individual who just doesn't like a person because of his or her race, and it could be because of his or her gender. But when these systems are tied to power, we're more so concerned with that. It's when Connor and his police force, he stands up against populations of people that are that we're more concerned with. When prosecutors and when prosecutors are more likely to charge, the Black person that commits an infraction when compared to his white counterpart. We're more concerned with that. And when the judge is more likely to give the Black person a little bit more time than the other, we're more so concerned with those kinds of things. And so view two, that second view, again, I think it explains the enduring nature of anti-Black racism in American society. And that's something else we have to account for. Yeah, we got to account for the disparities and other forms of injustice that we experience in society, but why has it endured for so long? So that's something else. You got to account for that. Why has it endured for so long? We're not the first people that's been online talking about these kinds of issues. Every generation, Dr. Carr has had these kinds of discussion. Again, view two moves us beyond engaging in the mental gymnastics necessary for identifying races and developing lists of racist beliefs, behaviors, and practices. I really like that. We engage in this mental gymnastics and trying to identify who the real racist is, and was that a racist statement, or were you offended by that statement? We get bogged down, and we miss, I think, sometimes when we focus on that, these bigger social phenomena again. The racial and ethnic health disparities, the disproportionate numbers of African Americans in jails and prisons and under judicial review. We don't talk enough about that. The wealth gap, and there's many educators online, and educational gap. View two, when you talk about it structurally, it helps to explain that a little bit better when racism is tied to power. Then you get these social phenomena that we are talking about. And so then I go into this discussion of racism as caste-like. Yeah, someone tried it. Hey, we don't have a caste system in American society. I agree with that. That's why I use the language of caste-like. Caste-like. We can say caste-like. The construct of racial caste moves us beyond over sentimental view of racism, and again, policing individual racist behaviors and actors, and focus on really this value gap. And the ethicists on the line would definitely get this to value gap, where some people are just considered more valuable than other people. That's the bottom line. Some people are just considered more valuable than other people. And it plays out in strange ways in the instruction. And I'm painting with a very broad brush here right now, that sometimes plays out as it relates to the instructions that's provided to inner city youth in school. It's just valueless. So we put a little less time into them. Maybe in our meetings, we just spend a little less time listening to certain individuals because of the group they're part of. So it's that value gap. We need to focus more on the value gap, where some are just valued more than others. And so, again, perhaps we can have some discussion around this notion of racial caste. And the whole idea is that it's a system of idea of a racial hierarchy. Is just built into the foundation of American society. It's just a part of the social contract, what some call the racial contract, where whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom, and then other groups fit somewhere in between. And these are what I'm about to say is, it could be a sticky issue and very sensitive issue. We so often in this in the country, in our community, always talk about Blacks and whites. But there are other populations and ethnic groups that are hold anti-Black views, and vice versa. So let me be clear about that. This xenophobia is really real. So again, something is going on in our society for sure as it relates to this racial hierarchy. We just got to put our fingers on it. Isabel Wilkerson is perhaps. She has a book, Racial Caste. I would normally hold it up. It's somewhere close by. She wrote an entire book about it called Caste. It's worth reading. But this notion actually goes all the way back to the 19th century. Tocqueville, Publishing Democracy in America, and he discussed this caste-like nature of race relations in American society. So again, this concept isn't a new concept, and I think it's worth pursuing if we're trying to make sense again of these the enduring nature of anti-Black racism and then some of the social phenomena that I was talking about. Then I go into this discussion of the contradiction of the institutionalization of the practice of racism in American society, just being basically inconsistent with American ideas, at least the ideas of our founders. I don't need to go into that tension because I think all of us know it. A nation founded on liberty and inherent equality between all people. Stole Black people from Africa and sold them on auction blocks and abused them and deemed them as chattel. I mean, you got to catch the contradiction. I quote Frederick Douglass. This is a quote that grabbed me, and I'm sorry for all the words. You might not be able to read them on your screen. This is a quote that grabbed me many, many years ago, and I like to refer to it when I can. Between the Christianity of this land, again, American was established, and we can have that discussion kind of as a Christian nation. Clearly, it's a secular society, but it's kind of established as a Christian nation, and I know there's a little tension in what I just said. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good and pure and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. So the Christianity of this land and Christianity more generally, to be a friend of the one is of necessity to be an enemy of the other. Gandhi said something similar to this. I love pure and peaceful and impartial Christianity of Christ. Therefore, I hate the corrupt, slave holding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. And that's Frederick Douglass. I forgot actually when he wrote it, but it was right around the time of emancipation. I think it was after emancipation, and it's a powerfully strong statement within its context. A racial caste and 4 levels of racism. I breezed through it: personally mediated and in-person and interpersonal racism, internalized racism, institutional racism, and systemic or structural racism. So one of the things I was hoping to do in the chapter, again, is just kind of unpack that a little bit, because we often just use the language in the common discourse. That was a racist act, or this person is a racism. But what do we really mean? And so I think sometimes people are talking about structural racism. At other times, they're talking about personally mediated racism. And at other times, they're talking about internalized racism. And I think it's worth making these kinds of distinctions only so we can be on the same page in our conversation. I'll give an example of internalized racism. We all remember guess it's been a few months now, I lose a little track of time, of the Black police officers in Memphis who literally, beat a motorist to death. All Black officers, and they beat a Black man to death. Many people are surprised, but it's internalized racism where a group will internalize the beliefs and internalize the values of the broader society and play out those values. And what we saw in that situation, very terrible ways. And then I move into this discussion as racism as idolatry, and this is getting more to the title now. Racism as idolatry, hence sin that Jackson talked about, and an attack on God. And I really like that language of attack on God. I think in many ways, sin is an attack on God. Then it go to the basic biblical teachings on the parentage of God and the kinship of all human kind, that which we would find in Genesis 1 and 2, the founding story of the Bible. God breathing, God, one, forming human beings with his very hands and breathing breath into human beings. For the tradition that I work out of, the ethical tradition that I work out of, it's that action that is the religious grounds for the basic worth, dignity, and moral standing of all human beings. Just right there, right there. God imbued it. God gave it. God gave humanity or human beings their value. And in many ways, we can stop right there. I already talked about inherent worth, dignity, and the like. And then I turn to this quote from Desmond Tutu, the bishop. So I tease a little bit. So one of the things I wanted to do, and one of the things I do in the chapter, I bring James Baldwin, Desmond Tutu, and Ellen White in the conversation. Tutu says this as he talks about creation. Of course, it's a divine act, ex nihilo, all of that. But something special has come into being. Human beings have this intrinsic worth. Life is a gift from God and should be acknowledged as such. Then he makes this statement in the article that I'm referring to. All of this makes human beings unique. It imbues each one of us with profound dignity and worth. As a result, to treat such persons as if they were less than this, to oppress them, to trample their dignity underfoot, Tutu says, it's not just evil, as it surely must be. It's not just painful, as it frequently must be for the victims of injustice and oppression. It is positively blasphemous, for it is tantamount to spitting in the face of God. It's like waving your finger in God's face. How do you treat God's creation? How do you treat God's creation as if they're less than? I get excited about this and really passionate, because I think that the theology that's embedded in Genesis 2 tells us that we ought to treat all human beings in a certain kind of way, treat them dearly and specially. And to do otherwise is tantamount to spitting in God's face, is throwing your finger up at God. It's an eloquent statement that really captures what's morally wrong with racist ideology. So we thank Tutu for that. And again, in a very eloquent way, identifying what's wrong with racist beliefs and the practice of racism. So just continue that exploration in the chapter. I'm coming to an end here. Then I turn to a couple statements from the church, One Humanity, a human relations statement addressing racism, casteism, believe it or not, tribalism, and ethnocentrism. It's a 2020 statement, and I just referred to it. Again, and there are many biblical texts that we can refer to as well, capture what we believe should be our Adventist commitment. I like this. Asserts a view that we maintain our allegiance to the biblical principle of the equality and dignity of all human beings in the face of historical and continuing attempts to use skin color, place of origin, caste, and perceived lineage as a pretext for oppression and dominating behavior. This is, again, a statement from the church in 2020. So they acknowledge that something has happened in the past, to be sure, and that something is going on now. These attempts are a denial of our shared humanity, and we should deplore all such aggression, call it aggression, and prejudice as an offense to God. Very consistent with Tutu's statement and what we learned from the creation story. Contrary to the teachings, again, this is on that same statement, contrary to the teachings and examples of Jesus, many believe in the church organizations have absorbed sinful, dehumanizing ideas about racial, tribal, caste, and ethnic valuing that has led to practices injuring and wounding the human family. These ways of thinking and the practices resulting from them undermine the very truths we have pledged ourselves to live and teach. We apologize. Again, Dr. Carr, you talked about an apology that Cliff Jones responded. We apologize where in the past we may not have spoken or acted boldly enough on these matters. And again, the purpose of our chapter, in part, at least one of the goals, is that we can have some conversation around these. So the church is extremely clear about its teachings, but it also acknowledges that from time to time, we've gotten it wrong. We've gotten it wrong, and we have to be open and honest to talk about that. I refer to in my chapter also a statement on the biblical view of the unborn, and trying to draw again on this idea that human life has this value and worth that we just must respect and take serious. Somewhere in the statement, and I won't read this one, but somewhere in the statement it says from the very early human life to the very end of human life, it has some value, or has fundamental value that we should be mindful of. And then I'm ending now, move to the kind of theological, while we wait, while we wait, what should we be doing as Christians while we wait on Christ's soon return? And I turn to Bergman. We all are familiar with Bergman. I think, what is the role of a prophetic community? We consider ours a prophetic community. Sometimes we should be crying out in the wilderness. Other times we should engage in the direct confrontation. Again, Bergman is reflecting on the Old Testament prophet, and I'm saying we should follow their leads. Other times there should be confrontation with empire, but we should always be speaking truth to power. And I should bold this last statement, and imagining a better social structure. I really believe that to my core. That's a part of how I try to live my life, and in my teaching, try to emphasize making our society a better society. I think that's a part of our Christian commitment in the world. And I think Adventists believe that at our fundamental core. I always say that our three best institutions are our local churches, so the pastoral ministry, our healthcare institutions, and our educational institutions. Our best three ministries, from my perspective, they're really trying to make society better. I think it's embedded in the institutionalization of those ministries in many ways. This kind of captures what Jackson talked about. Race is a social construct that is reified in society. So I'm a social constructionist here. And I think it's real, though. It's reified in society, and then it's perpetuated through the social practices of racism. And just like my colleague got at, it damages lives. Racism damages lives. It kills some people. It limits opportunities. And here's the key for my ethicists online: it stifles human flourishing. So this is why we should be concerned. It stifles human flourishing. As Christians, we must critique the practices of racism and engage in anti-racist work. In the prophetic traditions of old, we must call it out, be a voice crying out in the wilderness, because the sin of racism, and it is sin, ravishes and wreaks havoc in God's family. We must fight the good fight while we're waiting on Christ's return. And then the Micah 6:8, I'm sure you all are familiar with. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And we can't do that without making the crooked places straight. When we know things are kind of jacked up, we should try to fix them. And I end with a quote from Ellen G. White. After 60 years of public ministry, she speaks of our calling as Seventh-day Adventists. I was charged not to neglect or pass by those who were being wrong. The Lord presented such cases before me, and as disagreeable the duty may be, I'm to reprove the oppressor and plead for justice. I'm to present the necessity of maintaining justice and equity in all our institutions. And thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Lampkin. Thank you very much. The story with which you began, riding through that Chicago suburb and having that terrible experience, and then the Tutu quote. Wow. Just powerful, just powerful. Now, we've worked you very, very hard, Andy, but if you don't mind, I'd like you to take 3 more minutes to talk about your research.
Sure. You refer to the health disparities research?
Yes.
Sure. I spent, I guess, the last decade or so. It's actually been longer than that. Looking at African American health disparities within the medical context. We know that African American life expectancy, when compared to white counterpart, is less. African Americans are actually, white women are more likely to get breast cancer. Black women are more likely to die from breast cancer. You got similar things going on with prostate cancer. Jackson got at that a little bit, that prostate cancer kills a lot of Black men. So there are many disparities in the healthcare context, which leads in many ways to, when compared to their white counterpart, again, Blacks living shorter lives, and then oftentimes there are morbidity considerations that we got to give some consideration to. So making sense of those disparities, I spent a lot of time just trying to make sense of those disparities. There's a whole body of work out there now on health equity and health disparities. My initial interest, and I share this with Dr. Carr, my initial interest in these topics was when I was a graduate student, and I really wanted to, pursue African American attitudes towards healthcare and the like, and we kind of say, hey, there's nothing there. Then again, a whole body of literature, and it makes me proud that I had a thought when I was a graduate student that I wasn't able to pursue. It wasn't popular then. It wasn't enough literature. But in the past couple decades, that literature just has absolutely exploded. So again, thank you, Dave, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. And so then a part of the work that I attempt to do is to try to make sense of, hey, what should we say theologically or religiously about these disparities? And we run these healthcare institutions all over the nation. We have 5 systems, and we have healthcare institutions all over the world. What is our role in attempting to bring light to these health disparities, as well as working to reduce those disparities, because there is a lot of work to be done there, indeed. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Mark, and thank you, Maury. This has been very, very rich. Over to Monty now. Let's stay with Monty and then Simona and quit at 12:30. But then we have what's called the digital foodless potluck.
Yeah.
And people stay by and chat as long as they want to, sometimes till 4 p.m. So you're welcome to, and there's no, at the potlucks, you don't have to be on a structured agenda. You talk about whatever you want. So this conversation will continue in some form after 12:30. So over to Monty.
Okay, thank you, Dave, and thank you, those who have presented. A reminder about our discussion, and we're short on time, so this really applies. Please limit yourself to 1 point or question per time in the queue, so I don't have to. If you have 2 or more points, make sure to share your first point, and this will give us the opportunity to focus on that. I'll give priority to first times in the queue and to a gender balance in the queue. So I'm going to go to Ed and then Simona.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy, for the presentation. Sorry I was a little late getting here. I had a question. Is this whole issue of racism really just a North American phenomenon? I know we have had a long history of incipient racism, been very serious in our history. As a child, as a boy, for 5 years, I lived in South Africa. This is pre-Mandela, during the apartheid. And I want to tell you what, as a boy, I saw racism there that was unbelievable. And part of the reason is they've got basically 3 major racial issues to deal with. You've got the whites, of course, that are the Dutch, and then the Dutch, when they arrived, didn't bring their wives. So now they've got a whole segment of the population called the colored. And then they have the natives, which are the Zulus and the Xhosas and that and everything else. And all of them really don't like each other, or didn't at that time. So my question is, since, as I understand it correctly, from the demographics, we are now a church of the South, and that does not mean South United States, that means south of the equator. Is the human condition of racism really just a North American phenomenon, or is it a human condition? Thank you.
I think your discussion in many ways answers the question. It's a human problem, actually. It's a human phenomenon. Sometimes when I talk about racism, I talk about it in the class of xenophobia, that fear, dislike, concern against the other. And you gave the South African illustration. I think that's absolutely right. That's why I think the church's statement that I discuss in the chapter, it's not just meant for the North American context. I think it's meant globally. So you're spot on in it. The focus of my chapter, of course, is on racism within the North American context. That's near and dear to my heart because this is the context where we work out of. But again, I really do believe it's a part of a much larger phenomena. But it's worth talking about how it plays out in our society.
If you don't mind,
go ahead, Mark.
I just
Go ahead,
would
Mark.
like to chime in on that. Oh, sorry, Maury.
No.
I wrote a book review on white fragility for Spectrum, and Andy and I talked at length about it in the process. Ed, to your point, my reaction to white fragility, and if you haven't read the book, please do. It made me so angry, I just set it down and ignored it for months. Finally did look at it and read it. And my reaction was racism is a human problem, and the tendency to universalize or globalize a human condition. And in talking with Andy, he helped me get over myself and over my immediate tendency to dismiss American racism based upon that global human problem. And I have thus, since then, focused my attention on American racism. And in my essay, I position myself as clearly stereotypical white male American who had a wonderful, privileged life, and I'm trying to make sense of what happened in my context. And Ed, similarly in your context growing up, it is a human problem, but I think Americans far too quickly, like me anyway, far too quickly divert the conversation to the global human problem. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add one other thing. A lot of the analysis that authors in this volume did was to point out the role of colonialism and its relationship to Christianity. And one might say that even in the places where the church, where the communion of Adventist Christians are growing, the question is, are they growing with a colonized theology? Or are they growing with an indigenized theology of how Christ has incarnated in their cultures? And oftentimes what you find out is they're growing under a colonized theology.
Mm-hmm.
So that the very function of racism is shaping their consciousness unconsciously.
Thank you. I've got Simona's up next, and I have Peter, Dana, and Horace, and Anastasia. So Simona.
You know, I am white. I was born that way, didn't choose it. I'm female. I was born this way. I didn't choose it. There are lots of things I didn't choose. And I find that in human race in general, we are very good at pointing out at our differences and taking very little time to find out where we are together as humanity, or as Americans, or as Seventh-day Adventists. So we are pointing out towards the differences and making them so big, because the main point of the sentence that I have heard way too many times of "go back where you belong" is that you do not belong here. You do not belong here. And if you do not belong here, you need to go away, one way or the other. And I think my problem, you know, as somebody who wasn't born in this country, who is not affected by racism, but it hurts me. It hurts me to see how Black people are treated, and how they were treated, and how they will be treated in the future as well. Because we have structural issues that have to be addressed, and in order to address them, we need to recognize them. And I think one of the problems that I too often see is that people don't want to talk about the history of slavery, the history of segregation, the history of oppression and marginalization of these communities. So if you do not talk about it, if you don't recognize this, how can you rectify it? How can you make it better if you think that, well, it was in the past, we don't have to talk about it? One thing that I just recently learned is that since 1776, about 12 million men, women, and children were sold into slavery. 12 million. That's a huge number of people. We need to talk about it. We need to uncover all that filth and bring it to the air and discuss it and address the sins of our past so that we can live better in our present, in our future.
All right.
And that goes for church as well.
Any of our guest speakers want to comment on Simona's comment?
I would only say that there are different effects that racism has. Some are primary, some are secondary, some are tertiary. So I affirm what Simona was saying, although I think even you, Simona, are affected by it. And the question is, in what way is that effect happening?
All right. Thank you, Simona. Peter.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentations. I don't think that we have to be told too much about the evil of racism and how sinful it is and how horrible it is for a human being to enslave another human being and not treat it as a child of God equally. But one expression hit me, and I like a little bit clarification: systematic racism. And I was wondering how that could be, because that means, in other words, that everywhere you go, you find this racism. People are treated in a racist way. And I was wondering how that could be, because we got a black president elected 2 times, 2 terms. We have black senators, we have black congressmen, we have blacks in positions of responsibility. We have blacks millionaires, billionaires, and so forth and so on. Then
Okay, so Peter, I think you
I
asked a question
didn't
here.
finish. Let me finish.
Okay, your question.
Okay. My question is resulting from what I'm saying. And I was wondering if in one of your essays, somebody was treating this problem, how the federal government was dealing with these issues through different programs, especially from 60s until today. And if somebody has suggestions that they were not used in the right way, and you have suggestions that they should have been used in a different way, and you have some proposals for improvement.
Let me start. I think we all probably want to chime in on this one. We appreciate the question you spoke about, the evils of racism, and I think that's what the book captured. I think that's what we're all trying to capture here. In many ways, you say, "Hey, it's obvious." We absolutely get that. How does it play out now with electing a black president twice? We could talk about the racial resentment that came with that. The black billionaires and the like, and there's a lot to be said there, but examples of systematic racism and just how it's playing out in society. I remember a story growing up. My grandfather, my father's father, fought in World War I. He got a card. Here's a man who fought for the United States of America. The white people got a card. Here's a man who fought for his country. One man fought for the United States of America. The other man fought for his country, and that came from the federal government. So that people are being looked at differently. They're being seen differently, both fighting in World War I. Redlining, you may have heard of redlining, where cities were basically carved out and blacks were forced to live in certain parts of a town. A part of the segregation that I spoke about in the Chicago area, that was created. This was through social policy. So it's playing out in the system this way. Another example said I would be brief. Blacks went off to fight in World War II. They came back. Whites got the GI Bill, that they could go to school and they could get loans. Those were not available to but a very, very few African Americans. And so you can see how the system itself was built up against, and that's what people mean by systematic racism. So you got to pay attention again, as I think it was Simone talked about, hey, remember the history. There's kind of a forgetfulness of the history. Remember the history and how that history played out. Can't just wash your hands of it, because with the rise of the suburbs in the United States of America, it created a lot of wealth for people. The values in the inner city, the property values just went down, and the values in the suburbs just kept going up. And those are systematic things. Those are structural things. The government did that to people. And it has implications to this very, very day as it relates to the Black-white wealth gap in this country. Others want to speak. I'm sorry I went too long.
But do you think that racism is characteristic only for the white people?
Well, let's stay with this question. Mark or Maury, do you have a response to the original question?
Yeah, I want to first thank Peter. I think this is motivated with good intentions and with wisdom. And I want to just say a part of it is to add to that body of knowledge this way. I'm just finished a book entitled Race After Technology. And oftentimes we think that, well, maybe we just have these programs, computer programming that will give us kind of these neutral outcomes, and we come to find out they give us racist outcomes. And how does a computer do that, right? Well, because computer systems are systems developed by humans who live in their own systems, which are racist. And then once you see the computer spit out something that you didn't anticipate, you realize there is this kind of systemic passing on. There are many examples, but one of the important examples, I'll give you two that I think were important. One person driving in her car using GPS to get around had the GPS tell her to turn left on Malcolm 10 Boulevard. Well, obviously Malcolm X, and the X in his name was an important social awakening and awareness that whoever is designing the computer, they are coming from a context that it doesn't have the same value, right? There are also issues with camera technology that was designed to catch, to really catch a certain spectrum of light that kept Blacks marginalized out until the real need to get them on camera, to get them moving across with their passbooks in South Africa, where in fact, Mandela himself was arrested with the aid of George H.W. Bush, who was heading the CIA, to give him to the government where he spent 27 years and comes out under the administration of George H.W. Bush. What I think we have to keep in mind is this, and this is what critical race theorists have pointed out. Race neutral approaches to resolving the problems of racism have themselves been racistly designed so that the outcomes have not been beneficial. So the question is do we solve these things by race neutrality or by race consciousness? And let me give you what I mean. I asked my students, was my dad a bad parent for teaching me race consciousness when I'm pulled over by police, to have my hands on the steering wheel, to cross my hand over this way so the officer doesn't get trigger happy and kill me? Was he being an irresponsible parent, or was he being a responsible parent? Would he have been irresponsible to send me out assuming that I would be like the kid who might have different color hair, a skateboarder, just a normal teenager, and would that result in my death? These are important questions, and there are pitfalls to racial reasoning. I'll tell you right now, I got in a car accident yesterday. My wife and I were trying to pull out to get out of a parking lot and turn right. And while we're there waiting for the traffic, I see this monster truck behind me. And then next thing I know, I see it jetting toward me. Boom, it hits me. I'm wondering, now I'm thinking, is this a skinhead who just wants to injure me? He was the nicest guy. He was distracted by his children. He was worried about me and my wife's health. And I started to think to myself, wow, I wonder, do others have these kinds of thoughts when they get hit like that? I was afraid to get out the car to meet the man because I didn't know if he was going to come and just run me over, right? There are pitfalls to racial reasoning. However, I think my father did a lot of good in telling me and my brothers how to shape our behavior when an officer wearing a badge would pull us over. And that's a systemic issue.
I would just finally chime in very quickly and say, Peter, I've had many conversations with my white colleagues and cohorts from around the world, regardless of social context. And what I would say is that this is a yeah, but response. I get your point, but let me correct you, or let me add this point, or something of that sort. It has been extraordinarily difficult for me in this particular contextualized conversation about American Adventist racism to avoid the yeah, but. It's not appropriate in this conversation. There are no yeah, buts. The point is to attend to Adventist racism in America. And it's been very difficult for me to focus specifically and only on that because I have too many yeah, buts in my head.
All
But
right.
was
Thank you
was
very
made
much,
any
Peter.
progress or not?
Oh, I think there's progress.
Of
I
course.
answer to
But
that.
if I could just say, because this was a part of Peter's question, and I think it's important to respond, that the progress is, Peter, I would say, look at the progress as patient, vigilant endurance of a social movement. This can't be a policy decision made by certain people in certain areas, because that's not where the problem is. And if it took hundreds of years to get into it, we're not gonna get out in 2 decades. So I would say, let's have patience, let's have sustained conversation, communities like this one, and what the outcome of that problem will look like, we'll realize it can't be solved quickly, but it can if we live in hope.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter, and our guests. Up next is Dana. Then I still have Horace and Anastasia. Dana.
Yeah, I needed to see somebody. You have a black screen. I don't like to speak with a black screen. I come from a communist country that speaks security to me, secret police. Sorry about that. So thank you for your smiling faces. Let me go to Peter first. Let me tell you, Peter, because we come from the same country, how I define white privilege. I was in a line of car because the police was stopping every car, and they looked at my newer Mercedes, which, by the way, I got it broken for nothing. They looked at my newer Mercedes, they looked at the color of my skin and my blondish hair, and they let me pass. And I felt so bad in that moment, because I realized that if I had another color of skin, the Mercedes didn't matter. One thing. Another thing is, when I was in school at Loma Linda, I've tried to befriend all my colleagues. And I managed to do that with most of them. My Black colleagues were extremely surprised that I was pursuing their friendship. And it took me a long time to understand why. Why? It's because they had previous experiences when that didn't happen. That's my experience that I wanted to relate to you, in hope that maybe it will speak to you Now let's go to our presenters. I have my deepest gratitude to Dr. Jackson, who was my professor, and I'm missing him. To Dr. Lampkin, that I'm very sorry he left Loma Linda before I got to know him or talk with him, have a deep conversation. And to Dr. Carr, who again left Loma Linda before I went there, but Dr. Sarajakul always spoke so highly about you in all our ethics classes. So thank you so very much. I feel for you, Dr. Lampkin, for being spit on 3 times. One, literally, physically. Another time, professionally, when you were doing your master's and you were told there is no discrepancy or there is no racism in healthcare. It happened to me, and because in my dissertation, I talked about health disparities for women and children in Roma population back in Romania. Fortunately, from the time I came up with this idea to the time that I finished my dissertation, things have changed, and it was very well received. And the third time you were spit on theologically, I understand that. Let me tell you why racism in America is so shocking for me, because I'm a foreigner, obviously. It's
Okay,
shocking.
Dana, I'm going to ask you to move on. So maybe a statement, but not a question, or do you have a question?
Don't be mean to me today.
I'm not going to be mean to you.
Okay.
We have
Okay.
others in line in short time.
I know. I would have finished by now. Okay. Racism in America is shocking for me because politically, the image that America is selling is a country where freedom and justice are for all. And theologically, because it claims to be a country that is profoundly Christian, while spitting on God's face every day. You should have let me finish. I was going. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. No question.
All right.
Thank you, Dana.
Then we come to, thank you, Dana, for your comments. I do appreciate them. I can't always see the ending from the beginning. That's one thing that God didn't pass on to me. So thank you.
Yeah, but you should have learned to trust me by now.
I want to move on to Horace.
Hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I feel like from when I joined, the context of racism is being whitewashed by your panelists. For one reason, we talk about racism as a human problem. What does that mean? Secondly, when racism is only a modern phenomenon, and we cannot link, there's always differences, dislikes, and all that. But when you look and study the history of what we refer to as racism, it is systematically was designed and continue to basically oppress one group of people. I know we like to talk about xenophobic and all these things, but that was not the context of racism throughout the history of it. And all these systems are in place. Now, I say that, and since we are on short on time, but the problem we really need to face as Adventists is that there has been no progress in Adventism when it comes to racism. And front and center, we still have division of black and white churches and so forth. So then for us to talk about progress is an insult to us within the church that has been affected by many decisions the church make that affects our communities. Our communities are still in many dilapidated condition, and nothing is really done by the church as such, not by policies and so forth. So, and then we're talking about an apology, and Andy Lampkin in his book write about an apology. And I think that for me, that was an insult, because I do not care about an apology when you're not taking action within our communities and within our churches to make our churches be like the white churches and the white churches. And the last point I would make is that the construct of having white people is an insult, because there's no such thing as white people. White people came into history, the word white people came into the history in around 1619, maybe a little bit before that. So then and therefore, if we remove these from our language and talk about having people and stop differentiating white people, black people, because when you use the word white people, in our theology, we say white is good. So then if I'm black, then my theology is telling me I'm bad because I use black to be bad. And that is the problem.
Thank you, Horace. Our guests.
I would say there are ways of, thank you so much, Dr. Krogman. I would say there are ways of thinking about black not as evil, though. When I think of black, I think it's the first abode of God's existence. When I think of black, I think of the way in which God appears to Abraham in the night and Christ on the cross. In other words, there are symbols of darkness that are powerful and sacred and beautiful, as well as there are symbols of whiteness that have the same, but there are also symbols of whiteness that are ugly, leprosy, and some other kinds of things. And so, yeah, we have therapeutic metaphors, and we have metaphors that can be harmful. So I'll speak to that part of it, and I'll leave it if my other two have any other to contribute to.
The only thing that comes to my mind is, I mean, you got my attention when you said we have been whitewashing the issue today. Yeah, that's difficult. Maybe I'm struggling with that whole old white guy meaning well by engaging in conversations that I simply ought not engage in. Nonetheless, decades of experience teaching in classes about ethics. One simple illustration that I've never allowed myself to let pass is when someone in class says, you know, I'm a black-white thinker in ethics. It's either right or it's wrong. And of course, black being wrong and white being right. And I've never allowed that to go without comment because I just think it's a horrific idiom to use in America because of our racist background. And yeah, I don't know how else to respond appropriately, Dr. Krogman.
Yeah, I guess I would, kind of ditto that. I was taken back by the statement of we were whitewashing the discussion, because I think in our chapters and in our discussions, we were trying to be sincere and as honest as possible based on our experiences and based on us taking a look, a dive into trying to make sense of the issue. So I was taken back by that. And at some point, perhaps we can have a larger discussion about the whitewashing, what that actually means. And you talked a little bit about the history of race. You said a lot in your comment, the history of racism, and that it goes back to 16th, 17th century. These things are worth exploring and talking about. Again, it was just so much in the statement that needs discussion in and of itself. You drop some bombs on us and move on to the next bomb. But there's so many things that are just actually worth exploring and trying to make sense of. But I think all of the authors in the book, A House on Fire, our goal in writing our chapters and our hope is that we can have these kinds of discussions, that we can keep talking as a faith community. And then as we keep talking, we can understand each other better and better and better. We can learn to trust each other more and more and more. And then we can work towards that progress that you talked about. Maury didn't use this language, but as it relates to progress, as it relates to racism in the church and in the country, I think it's the progressive realization. We just got to keep working at it. We just got to keep working at it. You're not going to solve it over. You're not going to solve the problem overnight. We disagree as to what the problem is. So how can you solve a problem when we're not clear what the problem is? We got to make sense out of it. And we got to get on the same page and to talk about it, I think, honestly, frankly, rationally with one another, if we're going to really attempt to move forward. We talked about the diversity of our churches and what does that mean? Some churches Black, some white. You name a group, a population of people, they have their churches within Adventism. Is that a problem in and of itself? We got to explore those things. Is that really a problem in and of itself that, you have ethnic churches? We don't have regional churches on the West Coast, but you clearly have ethnic churches on the West Coast. What does that mean? Is that a problem? Just because it looks like a problem, it may not be a problem. And I'm not saying it's not a problem, but you have to be very, very clear about what the problem is, other than just kind of asserting it, that it doesn't look like what you would imagine, churches looking like. So again, all of the questions and the queries that you put out there are worth exploring, but we really kind of need to take them on one by one and actually make sense of them. But I think the challenge of the text, and I think the challenge of this discussion, and I thank Dr. Larson tremendously in bringing us together to talk about it, because I don't know if we could have had a frank discussion like this when I first started teaching in Adventist universities. I'm just being honest. I don't know if we could have had a frank discussion. And my colleagues on the line, Dr. Carr and Mark, we've been in many of these discussions, and we've had some pretty frank discussions. And I just don't know if we would have had those discussions 30 years ago. So progress, at least we're talking more about it. And I think we're talking more authentically and honestly about it. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think it's a Christian thing.
All right, thank you. Simona, I'm noticing that we are at almost 12:50 now. I still have Anastasia in the queue, and I'm in the queue, and people are starting to come back, but I wonder if we need to leave that for the potluck, and we should end the official discussion now. Simona, what do you think?
Well, I would say that maybe give the chance to Anastasia for a brief question or comment, very brief, since she was on the list for a while and originally, and then we can end and continue our discussion afterwards. Would this be okay?
Sounds great to me. So Anastasia.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, our wonderful presenters. Especially for me today is very important because Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians are commemorating the genocide by the Turkish state at the time, and I believe the global and our own home are both important to help and never forget. And the storytelling of Mark, without the stories, the people that are not in power cannot write books, history books. So storytelling, cooking, dancing, writing songs, and I thank you. I have the question this: do you see any one of our panelists a correlation of racism and nationalism, especially with what has been going on in our country, which has leads and may lead to genocide based on color, ethnicity, and religion? Thank you very much.
You said, do we see what?
A correlation that racism and nationalism, especially with what has been going on lately, but in history as well, have led to, well, Hitler and so on, to genocide because of race, color, ethnicity, and religion, minorities.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, Maury, I've
Go ahead,
got to
Mark.
run to another appointment, but let me just say quickly, yes. But I was never aware of it until I forced myself to read challenging material. And one of the most challenging books I've ever read in my theological attention is the book by James Cone, The Cross and the Hanging Tree. If that's not genocide, I mean, how can one compare and contrast different genocides?
Right.
But this one in particular in America was done literally under the cross of Christ.
Yes,
in ways that just if you read the book or accounts of crucifix or of hangings,
yes,
it's just it's wrenching. It's
yes.
yeah.
In Psychology of Today, there was several years ago an amazing article, Give Me That Old-Time Racism, and how religion has now been that have been stolen from the Christian way of seeing things under a certain political branch. And unfortunately, other churches that they could do what Martin Luther King has done are afraid to speak to power.
Yes, I think I would also add, and I would agree with Mark, that there is a relationship, but I might say that I have a more porous reading of racism than my good friend and colleague, Dr. Krogman. Yes, I would say its form may have emerged at a certain time more recently in the modern era, but I would also say that this has been with us, not just in terms of nationalism, but in the very conquest narrative of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I'm reading the Bible and I read that mixed half Egyptian, half Hebrew kid who curses his parents and gets stoned, I want to know, why did you have to say anything about his origin and as part Egyptian, part Hebrew? When I read about the narratives of going and wiping out an entire people and being authorized by God in the minds of, I see some real kind of proto-racial ways in which humans have been wrestling with throughout time. And when I read Cheikh Anta Diop's book, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, and he starts to talk about the Table of Nations and how the author takes Ham to represent Kemet or Hamet, and that uses that Egyptian word for its land, Hamet, or Ham begets Cush, using that Hebrew word for black, and he begins to just kind of tease out that this is not something lost on an ancient mindset. Now, it might have manifested itself in more unique and dynamic forms to support power and empire recently, but if we kind of disconnect from those early undifferentiated formations of this, we'll find it hard to trace it as it manifests in the Armenian genocide, as it manifests in the transatlantic slave trade, as it manifests in the Jewish Holocaust, these kinds of things.
Thank you so much. And social justice, if one wants to see that we have not progressed that much, all they have to do is to check the courts and see for the same sin or the same breaking of the law, a black kid and a white kid, a black man and a white man, and especially a rich white man, the black man never gets justice. So please look at those places and see how much injustice is in our courts and where is the church talking to power about this.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you for that discussion and for being willing to keep things brief so that we could hear from our guests. Simona, back to you.
David, I'm sure you have maybe a few words, and then I'm going to finish with our blessing in the end.
I do have a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much for having us. It was our honor.
Yes.
You know what an institution is? What is an institution? An institution is an organization that's designed to outlive its founders. All right? Will the kind of Adventism I like outlive me? And the answer is yes, because I'm looking at three people who will carry it on. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, David. Thank you to our three speakers. I'm sorry, Mark already left, Maury and Andy. Thank you very much. And everybody who contributed. I would like to end this with immortal words of Maya Angelou from her poem, Still I Rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. And our blessing for this week. In anxiety, may you find peace. In sadness, may you find comfort. In sickness, may you find healing. In loneliness, may you find company. In busyness, may you find space. In listening, may you find wisdom. In following, may you find hope in the one who meets our needs, who says, ask and you will receive. Amen.
Amen.